Okay, it has just turned 4 o'clock here in London, in the UK, where I am based. So that means it's time for us to start Trinity College London's Transformative Teachers webinar for this month. Thank you very much for joining us. I can see a few people in the chat box already have told us where they are from. So I will say a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know, as always, we have a plethora and a huge variety of peers, teachers, teacher trainers, teacher educators joining us from around the world. Um, just before we get started and I hand over to our speaker for today, a little bit of a reminder of what we'll be doing. So we're going to be here for about 1 hour. There will be time towards the end of this discussion or this delivery for questions. So if you do have those questions, you can either put them in the chat box, which I can see people are using already, and you can see there are lots of us here. So it might be wiser to put your questions into the Q&A, but please do keep using the chat box, giving us your opinions and comments. This is also being recorded, so if you have to drop out at any moment, don't worry, it's being recorded, and we will send you a recording of this once the webinar is over. As always, play around with all the buttons, make sure you've got the best view for you, and make sure you are interacting with us, as I said, through either the chat box or the Q&A box. And finally, everyone that is here today will automatically receive a report of attendance, as well as the link to today's recording. So, having said all that, I will now introduce our speaker for today. So, as you may have seen from his bio already, Mike grew up in Australia, but now lives in Berlin, Germany, where he teaches both English and German. He's a diploma qualified teacher of English, but also holds a Bachelor of Music and a Master of Teaching. So he's a qualified high school music teacher as well, which is very Trinity. Trinity having qualifications for both music and English language. And he says that it's this musical background which has led him to develop a keen ear for the sound of language and strong interests in the areas of pronunciation and listening skills. And he's begun to ask himself the question, how can we move students away from text and get them to open their ears? And that is what he's going to be talking to us about today. So hello, Mike.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here from wherever you're joining around the world.
All right, I shall hand over to you. And as I said, everyone, please keep interacting with Mike. I'm sure he'll keep an eye on that chat box as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much, Simon. And thanks, Trinity, for having me today. That's, yeah, really excited to be talking about this topic with everybody. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Just a moment. There we go. Okay, can you see that? Fantastic. Okay. So, all right, let's get into this topic, guys, the inseparability of reading and pronunciation. So thank you very much for the introduction, Simon. Yeah, so I do have a musical background. This is me in the top picture teaching intensive courses in Melbourne before I came back to Germany and teaching some music to an autism unit group in Sydney. And yeah, I'm a musician, which I think has definitely played a big role in my teaching. I've also learned German to C2 level, which I'm really proud of. And some of the techniques that I talk about today will be things that I also did while learning German. And I'm very happy with the progress that I've made in German there too. So, okay. So let's start with a little test, everybody. Here we've got some different languages and different items on the screen. I would like to know if you can read them. So I'll just give you a moment there. Can you read number 1? Can you read number 2? What about number 3? Can you read that? Number 4, can you read that? Number 5, 6, 7 here. Okay. So now I've got this question for you. What makes reading successful? And what do you do when you encounter unfamiliar words? So I imagine number 1 didn't pose too many problems for you. Number 2 might have slowed you down a little bit. There are some words here that perhaps you don't know the pronunciation of. So I'd like you to maybe think for a moment, what did you do in that point? A lot of people would tend to slow down and maybe try to sound out the word in their heads. Here we've got some Latin. I don't know how to pronounce things in Latin. Here is some Bulgarian, and Polish, Georgian, and something from Train Spotting here in Scottish English down the bottom. So if you were a Scot, I imagined you're more able to read that successfully than I would be with my Australian accent. Okay. So some common beliefs about teaching pronunciation and reading. These are different things that I've encountered over my years, and indeed things that I thought myself or believed myself in my earlier stages of my career. So in terms of reading skills transfer from the L1. This is a common belief. Slow readers need to practice more reading. Okay. I certainly didn't know what reading was and how it worked. It seemed to just kind of be magic. People look at a text and just know what it means somehow, but what's actually happening? Reading text aloud doesn't mirror a real world skill, so it can be discarded. This is a thought or an attitude that I've heard out and about, and something that some people probably still believe. Number 5, students should be comfortable glossing over unfamiliar words. Okay, so the idea is with that one that, you know, the students will inevitably encounter a lot of unknown words when they're reading out in the world, and that they need to relax and continue reading and try to form reading an understanding of meaning from that. With terms of pronunciation, it's a common belief that pronunciation and reading are indeed separate and they're not related, and that teaching pronunciation is not a priority. Some people might think my accent is only one of many. Why should I enforce students to speak with my accent? Or indeed that pronunciation teaching is not appropriate in English as a lingua franca contexts, where the role of the native speaker is less important than it has been in the past, or the native speaker models. Okay, so which do you agree with? Which do you disagree with? You can write some comments in the notes there. Okay, so why did I come to this topic? So as I said, pronunciation is not a priority for many, but it was always a priority for me. And I always had a good response from my students and the support that I gave them there. So I started noticing that people had different attitudes. And yeah, they're seen as separate, which I tended to disagree with over time. Pronunciation teaching feels demoted. In some conversations I've had at conferences, I've sort of felt this as well, that it's not seen as important as other skills in a business English context, international context, for example. Communication, intelligibility is the key, but that means that we're sort of taking our foot off the gas a little bit in terms of pronunciation. Teaching pronunciation only when communication breaks down. Do we wait until that moment where communication has failed before we intervene and teach pronunciation? I don't really see it that way. And I noticed that there is an obvious mismatch between reading ability and listening. So here in Germany in particular, a lot of people say, I'm really, really comfortable reading, but listening, I can't understand people when they read. And it seems like some people's reading ability might be sort of, you know, C1, B2, but their listening is really, in reality, only sort of A2. Yeah, so another reason, coursebook reading activity sequence has never quite felt right to me. There seemed to be something missing. And yeah, my pronunciation approach seemed to sort of go down well, and reading aloud and activities like that seem to be well received by students. And last year at IETFL in Brighton, Adrian Underhill also said in his talk, he said something similar to this on a slide. He had all 4 skills and the pronunciation put over the top. And I thought, absolutely, I 100% agree. And I started spending some time looking into how that works. Okay, so in initial teacher training courses, generally there are the 4 skills. So we've got reading, writing, speaking, listening, and these are sort of seen as separate skills. You know, the sub-skills of reading would be things like making predictions, skim for gist, reading for comprehension. And pronunciation is a sub-skill of speaking, not of reading. It's not related to reading. It also deprioritizes bottom-up reading skills. So it's sort of we start at the top and move in, as opposed to sort of piecing meanings together from the bottom. And there's a real strong emphasis on using tasks that are real-world tasks as well. Okay, so things like reading aloud might be not accepted in that kind of idea. That's mantra. And that the function words are not as important for stringing together meaning in a text as well. You know, if it says at 6 o'clock or on 6 o'clock, it doesn't matter. The student understands 6 o'clock. That's all that's important in terms of reading comprehension. Okay, so there's lots of timed reading tasks. I kind of thought that that was a bit strange as well. I'm telling a student what he has to do when he's reading. You only have 2 minutes for this text. And the more, the better. They have to just read more to get better. There we go. And often in terms of reading as well, the teacher is the person that gets to choose what words are going to be taught in the terms of reading. So the teacher will say, okay, these words are bound to be new to the students. I will teach these 5 words, and that will not hinder comprehension. And that sort of suggests that we know better than our students. And they're also are taught to guess from clues. So as opposed to sort of digging deeper into some of the individual words and, oh, well, what do you think it might be from this? From the context, what do you think it could be? And the idea here is that it's impractical to check the meaning of every word. Sort of argue that this is changing a little bit with access to internet and the tools that are available these days. You can indeed check a word meaning very, very quickly. And also that passive vocabulary will feed into productive vocabulary too. So if you're reading and lots and lots and lots, the idea is that this will then come out later magically in your speaking. And yeah, if the task is completed, then our job is done. Students have understood the text. I move on. I don't need to work on with that anymore. Okay. But wait, let's go back in time a little bit. So I started thinking to myself, okay, what is actually reading? What is this skill of reading and speaking? And how are they different? Okay, so I just, with a bit of help from my friends, ChatGPT, I did a bit of research here. So we've got a quick history of spoken and written language. So let's remember how long we've been able to read for. It's really, really not a long time in contrast to how long we've been able to speak. So we're looking at millions of years since we've been able to start making speech. 300,000 years ago, we were able to sort of start communicating properly. And if you look at that length of time compared to written language, so, the printing press only came out in 1440. That's not that long ago. And the ability to read at the start of the 19th century, up to 20% of people were literate in Europe alone. So yeah, and now in the 2000s, there we go. Yeah, so literacy is quite high these days, of course, but it's not a given, So reading is not something that we have naturally evolved to do. Kids will learn to speak, but they won't learn how to read. Children require explicit teaching to be able to read. Okay, so let's look at how children learn to read. Let's look at the different stages. Now, I'm basing this on my readings in this book by Stanislas Dehaene. He's a French cognitive scientist who's looked into how reading works and what's happening in the brain. We learn to read as children in between the ages of 12 and 24 months. And then we learn to read from the age of 4 to 7. This obviously varies a little bit, but an important part of it here is that people learn to read so much later than they learn to speak. So people are actually already fluent by the time they start to read. So Dehaene says that there are 3 stages of reading. There's the pictorial stage. So this is where children will first begin to recognize single words. So they might recognize their own name, but they're unable to sort of break it down into the individual phonemes. Then there's the phonological stage, and this is with a lot of heavy reading aloud and listening. And then at this point, we're matching graphemes and phonemes together. Okay, so the children will begin to recognize the spelling patterns like the A and the E. So this sort of is the magic E sound, and then the B and the L, and these bits are all coming together. And if you walk into a children's elementary school classroom, you see all of these different sound charts around the room as children are developing an awareness of the phonics of the language. And then the last stage is the orthographic stage, which is where we have the ability to read silently and can access direct word meaning without having to sound the word out anymore. So we are expert readers at this point in time, and we're then able to read fluently. So words are recognized as a whole. We don't necessarily have to recall the sound of the word anymore. So you will, if you have seen children learning to read, you will know that they have to read things aloud. It's impossible for them to learn to read without sounding things out aloud. Okay, so Dehaene says that phonemic awareness is a prerequisite to reading acquisition. So we have to have this phonology there. And things like phonemic games improve reading, which show a strong link between the pronunciation and reading. And incidentally as well, English-speaking children need a lot longer to learn to read than do children of languages which are more phonetic, like Italian or German or Spanish. Okay. So important takeaways here. We learn to read after we learn to speak, once we've got that phonological repertoire there, which is often different to what we expect of our students in adult language teaching. Okay, let's look at some myths about reading. So 1, we learn to read visually, bypassing phonology. So we're not even thinking about the sound, we're just doing it quietly. But Dehaene says that when we encounter a new word, we slow down and we apply a pronunciation to it. So you might have done this in the activity we did at the beginning with the different languages. And when you saw those challenging words, you might have slowed down, hang on, and tried to sound it out a little bit, even if you're doing that silently in your mind. And of course, Lightbound and Sparta in their important book, How Languages Are Learned, they say that we often mispronounce words that we only see in text. So, for me, the word was epitome. I think I said epitome the first time I saw it, and was saying that for a little while. So yeah, just a little prompt for the chat there. Which word did you initially mispronounce just by seeing it in reading? But yeah, that's evidence that we do apply pronunciation to words and we don't just absorb them silently. Okay, ooh, what's going on? There we go. Okay, number 2, we can learn to read effectively without phonics training. So this is called the whole language approach. It was an approach that was big in the 70s and 80s. So whole language approach versus phonics teaching. It was sort of a battle over the decades. And this immerses children in reading, but it doesn't give them the kind of phonics training that we're looking at on the other slide. This is an example of an activity that a student might do with that sort of approach. The idea is that fluency will develop naturally and that phonics teaching will detract from comprehension. So this was a global policy for teachers for decades, peaking in the 70s and 80s in California. But I think there was a sort of a law for it as well, but it has been discredited. And there's zero, I had to put this bit from Wikipedia, zero scientific support, but Budden absolutely pulls that apart in his book as well and says that's not based on any research at all. Okay, so reading and pronunciation are separate. We've talked about this. So Budden says that both meaning and sound are recalled together and reinforce each other when we're reading. Catherine Walter, in her research, says that an unreliable phonological inventory equals poor reading performance. This is the position paper, the Oxford University Press position paper. Catherine Walter, Robin Walker, he said in this paper, they were saying that beginners learning to read pronunciation is not an optional extra. Okay. And so this idea that skills are transferred from the L1, that's a common belief as well. Things like scanning for detail or reading for gist or reading for comprehension. We should sort of train students to do these things. So understanding narratives is cognitively the same regardless of the medium. This is what Walter is saying in her paper. She's saying that our ability to sort of put stories together in our brains, it could be through pictures, it could be through word, it could be through or it's sound. It's sort of an internal structure. It's not related. It's not rooted in linguistics or in language. So is it transferring from the L1? Not really. So they're able to access this skill through the L1, but it's not rooted in it. Yeah. Okay. So strategic readers activate prior knowledge while reading, synthesize, draw inferences, and check faulty comprehension. These skills are also not linguistic. Okay, so I had a little bit of a look at some different activities. So these are kind of simple things that children would be doing in class. So we've got letter and sound matching, rhyming games, listening to read alouds, and all these kinds of things. And then these are kind of various activities that we might be using with our adults. Just as an interest, I was like, okay, well, which ones of these are actually going to be dealing with the sound? So up here we can see a lot of the stuff that we're doing in class and the course books show us to do don't actually deal with the sound of the language and the text. It's sort of just dealt with completely separately because reading is separate from speaking and pronunciation. So you might be doing these things. So jigsaw reading, you might lead towards sort of speaking or reading aloud. You might choose to do that with your students, but course books are not showing us to do that. Okay, so if you just follow the course book, you won't be doing this stuff. You won't be matching sound and reading. Okay, so how does it actually work? So let's have a look into Budden's work a little bit here. So he says we've got 2 routes for reading. So I'm going to read out a little part of this book to you and what he says. So just pull this up. Oh, there we go. Okay, so Budden says 2 information processing pathways coexist and supplement each other while we read. When words are very regular, rare, or novel, we preferentially process them using a phonological route in which we first decipher the letter string, then convert it into pronunciation, and finally attempt to access the meaning of the sound pattern. Conversely, when we are confronted with words that are frequent or whose pronunciation is exceptional, our reading takes the direct route that first recovers the identity and meaning of the word and then uses the lexical information to recover its pronunciation. So what he's saying is, so let's say, we're reading a text like this. If we come across a new word, which we'll inevitably do when we're reading, then it will inevitably take the phonological route. So words like gambit and banish and nimble as well, you might slow down a little bit because they're less frequent, but they follow it's kind of normal phonological rules. So they'll be converted to pronunciation and then the meaning is retrieved and then we understand it here. But for when we get very, very good at reading and we encounter mostly frequent words, then we don't have to sound them out basically. And we can just look at a word and you immediately retrieve the meaning. And then that comes first, and then the pronunciation comes afterwards. If you look at words like Wednesday through school, It's not summer, school, or Wednesday is a word that, you don't even think Wednesday. You know it's Wednesday straight away because you're retrieving the meaning first and then the pronunciation comes afterwards. You don't sound it out and they go, oh, wait, no, it's not Wednesday, it's Wednesday. Okay. So, and he says that there is evidence from patients with brain injuries to verify this stuff. So if there's damage to the phonological root, the patients are no longer quickly able to sound out words, and they might mix up words that are sort of a same semantic field. So if they see the word ham, they might think of the word meat. Painter and artist are some other examples that he's given. But then you see other words that are very, very frequent but irregularly spelled, like women or eyes. They're still able to they access the word meaning, and then the pronunciation comes afterwards because they're already familiar with those words. Okay, but if there's damage to the direct meaning root, this is sort of the opposite happens. So they can pronounce a word like banana, but if they encounter a word that is irregularly spelt, then they struggle with it because they're not able to enjoy direct access to the meaning of the word to then recall the pronunciation. But it can convert print to sound if it's still spelled regularly. Okay. All right. And he says that there is evidence from children as well when they're learning to read. So some kids might say house and home and get those two words confused. So there might be an over-reliance on that root. Or they might see a word like oven and they actually know the word oven, but they still see it and go oven or something like that. Okay. So I think that's pretty compelling evidence, and it sort of fits in with my learning and teaching experience as well. So I think we can be quite confident that this is supporting these ideas. So Da'an says that both pathways are necessary and a single integrated system emerges over years of training. And of course, as he says, we've forgotten how we learned how to read. If you think back to, okay, when I was in school, can you remember anything about learning to read? Can you remember how challenging it was? Could you say, I learned to read in 1 year or it took me 5 years? I have no idea. I don't know what activities we did. I just can't tell you anything about that now. And he says that we think we can just lay our eyes on a word and immediately the word pops to mind. So these pathways reinforce each other. So when you think about it like this, how could this transfer to a new language? So the reading ability is based on the building up of the phonological repertoire in the brain and being fluent in the language already. So yeah, that's my question that I sort of started asking. Of course. Okay, so we've got these 3 stages again. So adult expert readers are here. If you're reading your L1, you can just look at the word, you know the meaning straight away. Many L2 learners are here. So they're still at the stage where they don't have that strong phonological repertoire of the words that they're reading and seeing. But we'd sort of treat them like they're here. We're like, oh yeah, just read. Yeah, okay, comprehension. Yeah, okay, you seem to understand it. So, okay. But we're not doing anything to make sure that the students are sounding out the language and the words accurately in their minds. Okay. Can you read this? Give us a thumbs up if you can read it without an issue. Okay. So according to a researcher at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without a problem. So how does this work? Well, now we know. We are all accessing direct word meaning. But imagine giving that to a student who's A2. How would they go? They would not be able to do that because they don't have direct access to word meaning. So we are so familiar with these words that the brain sees the jumble of letters and immediately recalls that word. So I can read it out aloud because the word meaning is accessed first, and then the pronunciation comes after that. Okay, so based on what Da'an says, this makes perfect sense, and it's not really a mystery at all. Okay, so now I'm going to do another little test with you. Not a test, a little activity. I'd like you to look at the flags and choose the language that you're least familiar with. I'm going to display a sentence. It's the same sentence in all of these different languages, but I just want you to focus on the language that you are least familiar with. Okay, and when I've displayed the sentence, here we go. So read the sentence in the language that you are least familiar with, and see if you can piece together a meaning of that sentence. Okay, so the language here that I'm least familiar with is probably Portuguese. But I'm looking at that and I'm recognizing hotel, modern, tem. I speak Spanish, some Spanish. So it's like tener, maybe un. It kind of looks like Spanish. Conexión, fantástica, internet, and cafe. So it could be cafe or it could be coffee. I'm not quite sure. Okay, so something about the hotel has a fantastic internet connection and a great coffee or something like that. Okay, now, can you read that language? Does that mean that you can read that language? I just read and strung together the word meaning in Portuguese, but does that mean that I'm fluent in Portuguese? No, I have absolutely no idea what the sound system of Portuguese is. Yeah, but I just recognize a lot of cognates there. So when I see this word here, moderno, or however that's pronounced, I apologize for my Portuguese, then I'm recalling, well, German, English, and Spanish. So I've got access to the word meaning without having to pronounce it and speak it out aloud. But if I want to speak Portuguese, I need to know how to pronounce that word. So we can directly access word meaning for cognates of familiar words. And within the European languages, within the Germanic languages, there are so many cognates that we can just immediately understand. In English, international. In German, international. You know, but just because I see it and I understand the meaning doesn't mean I'm sounding it out correctly. So these words do not necessarily take the phonological route. So the sound is retrieved automatically. Can you see the problem? So we are lazy and can read automatically in our L1 without consciously activating the phonology of the language. So when we understand an L2 text, we might be inadvertently accessing L1 pronunciation. So what can we do about it? All right, I'm going to do a little activity with you. Okay, yeah. I'm going to read a short sentence to you in Australian English. And you are going to transcribe it. You're going to put it in the chat, okay? You are only going to get one opportunity to listen to this, and you're not allowed to write anything from 10 seconds. I'm going to have to go back and then come back to this slide again. And then after the 10 seconds, write the sentence in the chat. So I want you to hold on to what I say in your mind and then write it in the chat. Don't write anywhere else, only in the chat after 10 seconds, okay? Are you ready? Here we go. I've got to go down to the shops, Savo. Okay, I saw some people writing in the chat before the 10 seconds was up, but that's okay. Yeah, so this sentence was, I've got to go down to the shops, Savo. The Savo is quite typically Australian English. Yeah, so what you needed to do to hold on to that in your mind, that's something that we're going to talk about right now. Okay, so that's the phonological loop, basically. Okay, so the phonological loop is this feature that enables us to hold on to it. Here we go. So we don't need to look at that into too much detail. This is the Baddeley's model of the phonological loop and how memory is working. So he basically says that there's this rehearsal process of sound that happens in our brain. And once we've sort of held on to it for a little bit, then that goes into our long-term memory after that. Okay, and so what are the people in languages saying? So this is a short-term memory mechanism. It holds information in phonological form. It automatically uses unconscious subvocalization, so we're sort of resounding out the sounds in our mind, and in doing so, we're feeding into the long-term memory as well. So if you're thinking about a context and you're thinking about the sounds of the words to articulate that context, then those two are going to be linked together and then sent off into your long-term memory. Okay, and they're saying that as well that there is a strong consensus that good pronunciation assists long-term memory through the phonological loop. Okay, so if you're activating an accurate representation of the sound, the words, language, the pronunciation in your mind, then that's going to send it off to long-term memory. But if you're not doing that, we'll talk about that process a little bit more in a moment. Some people say it's like a mental workbench. So you kind of got the thing that you're focusing on there in front of you. I like to think of the way that the memory is working as desire paths. So these pathways that people take is known as a desire path. So obviously one person walking across it is not going to be enough, but as each incident happens or as each person walks across it, then it's creating a new neural pathway basically. So every encounter that you have with the sound of the word and that word with its meaning, then you will create stronger and stronger connections in your brain through the use of the phonological loop. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk you through. This is kind of my little representation of how this works. So an L2 reader encounters a new word. What happens? So let's say this is the sentence here. She's the epitome of professionalism, always prepared, respectful, and willing to go the extra mile. So the new word is epitome. So let's talk through the different options here. Okay. So let's say the word is glossed over. It's not sounded out. Doesn't go into the phonological loop. The word is lost. Okay. Words meaning is understood in context. You know, that's what the reading tasks are telling us to do, but they're not focusing on the sound of the word. So it's not sounded out. Well, it's not going to go into long-term memory there either. Okay, so let's say the word is now understood in context and sounded out. Then what options have we got? Okay, so maybe the student uses their L1 pronunciation as a guide for the word. Then it's going to be enforcing their or reinforcing their accented L1 influence pronunciation. So, you know, I'm not going to say that's a good or a bad thing. That's up to you to decide, but, you know, that's what's going to happen, basically. If that's the pronunciation that's recalled, that's what's going to be reinforced. Perhaps they understand that it's different. So in German, for example, the Z is pronounced as a TS sound, and I have to tell that to my students a lot, and I remind them, and then they can go back and they can correct it. So, you know, their awareness of the phonology of that language might mean that they can access the pronunciation. If they get it right, fantastic. They will reinforce good pronunciation, but they might reinforce weak pronunciation if they're not quite sure. And of course, to be 100% sure, they can check the pronunciation online, listen to an audiobook, whatever it may be, or really, you know, get their oral input from a reliable source. Okay, now let's say a learner requires a reader encounters a known word. Okay, this is what Robin Walker and co have said. Students need guidance in the correct pronunciation of new vocabulary so that they do not apply their L1 sound spelling norms to English, the English words they are learning. For example, they may pronounce the word real as real. This would not normally be intelligible to listeners with other L1s, and communication would be compromised. So we've got this sentence, she's a real friend, kind, helpful, and always there for me. So we're taking this word real. So the word is recognized, you know, if they've got direct access to word meaning, you know, they will, if it's a cognate, they'll see it and it will recall their pronunciation. If they don't focus on the English pronunciation and they say, okay, I've understood it in context and I'm not sounding it out because it's reading, the reading is done silently, then they are going to be reinforcing the L1 influence pronunciation. Okay, and that will lead to them having accented pronunciation. Maybe they recall accurate pronunciation, so they just stop for a moment. So they might do it automatically and realize, oh, that's different to my language. It's pronounced like this in this language. So they're reinforcing accurate pronunciation. Or they might say, oh, I'm going to say, wait, no, my teacher told me it wasn't that real. And they might repeat it a couple of times, and then they're recalling and saving and storing the accurate pronunciation. So that's what will go into long-term memory. Okay. So what does this mean for language learners? Well, implications for L2 language learners. So when we don't know a word's pronunciation, the phonological loop cannot hold onto it for very long, and it doesn't go into long-term memory. Nativeness here is not the goal, but pronunciation must be stable, easy to pronounce, and intelligible to both native and non-native listeners. This week, I'm teaching a class, and a student is really struggling with the distinction between work and walk. And you can imagine that that would lead to a lot of intelligibility issues as well. So that's something that she's going to have to focus on specifically. It must be reliable. Catherine Walter says a reliable L2 phonological repertoire contributes significantly to the ability to comprehend L2 written texts. You know, when you're able to just gloss over it, you're enjoying direct access to word meaning, but that only comes once you've gone through the stages of the phonology, building up your phonological repertoire. Students need guidance so that they do not apply their L1 sound spelling norms to English words that they are learning. So yeah, comprehension cannot be the only success criteria in this case. Okay. Speakers of languages like Italian and Spanish will have to work harder to uncouple their existing phonological repertoire. So yeah, that's my observation. With English speakers, there is a sensitivity towards different spellings and pronunciations. And I've noticed in my experience in Germany, Germans are a little bit more sensitive to that as well. In words like Wednesday, they all know it's Wednesday. Nobody says Wednesday or anything like that. So, but I've had experience with Italian and Spanish speakers, and they kind of struggle a little bit more strongly. And yeah, as Robin Walker says in his video, prescribing weak readers with more reading simply makes the problem worse. Weak readers need more pronunciation support, not more reading. Okay. So how can we diagnose what is happening in students' heads? How do we know where the issues are, you know? If they've got 70%, 80% in their reading comprehension task, you know, we want to help them and support them. What can we do? How do we know if they're struggling or not? There's only one way, as far as I can see, that we can be 100% sure if they're sounding everything out correctly in their minds or not. We need to be using reading aloud. Okay, I'm just going to preface this by saying only one student have had ample opportunity to work with the text or clarify any language and read the text silently. But yeah, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. But with reading aloud, immediately I know if a student has understood the text straight away. I can tell if they're using L1 influence pronunciation. I can identify what I perceive their pronunciation priorities to be. I can also hear, this is a really, really big point. You can tell if they're chunking the text correctly. You know, if they read the sentence and they sort of say, oh yeah, and Peter went to the shops and he bought a, you know, and they're sort of dividing the sentence up in an unnatural way, you pick it up straight away. And there are lots and lots and lots of people who talk about pronunciation and reading and are in support of it. Robin Walker, Gemma Archer, Adrian Underhill, Sasa Mosia and team, yeah, and the guru John Levis as well. Okay, so this idea that reading aloud doesn't mirror a real world skill and should be discarded. So I'm a musician and I know that, you know, I practice scales on my instruments and that's not a real world skill. You know, when I play a song, I'm not sitting there playing scales, but I know that that has utility and will support me in other areas of my musicianship. You know, so you look at piano or guitar, you know, practicing scales is the sub skill, but then the real world skill is performing football or soccer. Repetitive passing drills, you know, you don't pass backwards and forwards between only two people constantly in a game of football, but that's still a very, very useful thing to do because you're getting a feel for your feet and everything. So you might know this song in terms of vowel substitution, and this is what Daon was talking about as well. He, you know, that song, I like to eat apples and bananas, and then you change the vowel to eely to eat, and that helps develop phonemic awareness with children and the ability to substitute different sounds in, and that supports reading, as he says. But yeah, that's not a real world skill. We never walk around doing that with songs. Yeah, so driving, cooking, you know, you could probably think, maybe you can write in the chat, are there any skills that you can think of, greater skills and a sub skill that's not related to the real world skill? But of course, it's still useful if you're trying to get good at that particular skill. I'm sure you could find many examples. Okay, so why must all tasks be real world skills? Yeah, I was just thinking to myself, you know, why is it that there's this kind of this idea that it's not a good thing to be getting students to read aloud? And this is what I've found. So when communicative language teaching began to take over in the 70s, so a lot of techniques for teaching pronunciation at the segmental level were flatly rejected. So segmentals is the sounds, the phonics basically. Because this is not communication or a real world skill, you know. And Noonan in 1989, and he was heavily involved with sort of syllabus design and communicative language teaching. He acknowledged in one of his books that there was severe criticism of bottom-up approaches at that time. You know, so yeah, and it kind of fits in with we looked at the whole language approach before as well, and this idea that the phonics teaching even for kids was inappropriate, so sort of around that time. But yeah, even Noonan did acknowledge that there is some merit in bottom-up skill development. Yeah, and I came across, so where did this come from? Okay, I've got an interesting example for you. In grammar translation, of course, there's no focus on speaking fluently or fluency. You know, we're just going backwards and forwards between languages, and this is something from the start of the 20th century when there was no audio and stuff like that. Audiolingualism, people weren't learning to speak. So, okay, audiolingualism, let's go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Lots of drilling and behaviorism sort of built into it, but less focus on meaning. I came across this activity called I'm a Chair. I cannot think of why this has got real world utility, but I think maybe there was then some activities that people were trying to move away from. They're saying, look, you know, what have we got here? You the tasks that the students are to do. Tell your students they are an armchair. As an armchair, ask them to write 20 questions addressed to their favorite armchair about experiences. If I saw this, if I was learning Spanish and this teacher asked us to do this, I would I cannot relate this to what is going on in life. Like, how do I do that in English? I wouldn't know which language I would use in English to do that because it's a ridiculous task. So, I think it's sound advice to tell an early career teacher to focus on tasks that have real world relevance or can be done in the real world. Absolutely. But reading aloud is something that is so fruitful that we cannot write it off. Yeah, I'm a chair. So when using reading aloud, this is my advice here. Make sure that students have repeated exposures with a single text. So they might listen to it, they might read silently, check comprehension. You can still do all the other comprehension and the scanning for gist, whatever, those sorts of activities. But make sure students have time to deal with the meaning of the text, because when you're reading aloud, if you ask a student to read a text aloud that they haven't seen yet, they're not activating the meaning of the text, and their cognitive resources are so focused on the sounding it out right that they're not activating the semantic center, the meaning center of their brains as well. So they really, really need time to get familiar with the text first so they can bring that knowledge, that comprehension knowledge and the intonation ideas into their reading aloud. You can analyze prosody features together as a class. I'm going to show you how I do that. And you can preempt challenges. So when I'm speaking to teaching German speaking students, I know the kind of issues that they're going to have, so I'll highlight them along the way. So when they're reading it, if you're walking around the room, checking them reading aloud and they're making mistakes and you haven't warned them of the potential mistakes, it's like you're trying to catch them out. So really, really try to support them before you do that. And if, probably be very, very careful before thinking about doing this with a secondary school class. So you sort of have to know your students, but it's so valuable. So if you can learn how to set it up in your class and sell it to them, they'll get a lot of utility out of it. So you might want to give them a chance to rehearse the text. Tell students to read with enthusiasm. That's all you need to do to get them to kind of think about the intonation or how to bring it alive, and make sure it's a really supportive atmosphere as well. Okay, so when you're preparing for reading aloud, you might take a text like this. So you might have done any other activity with this text. They've done a comprehension thing or whatever it may be. You can go through and you can display this on the board and then start highlighting sort of the stress syllable of the content words. So they're making distinctions between content and function words. So content words carry the meaning, like first time, missed, and the function words are the little grammatical words like I, to, and the pronouns could be function words as well. So to the are function words, airport is a content word. Once you've done that, start looking at the intonation. So sort of think about, okay, which words are the most important words here. This was a number of different texts detailing stories about missing flights. So missing a flight is already the topic, so that's not stress. I'm like, okay, well, the first time I missed a flight, I actually left really early and planned to arrive almost 2 hours before my flight. However, when I got to the train station, so you're sort of going through that with the students, and then you can try different variations with them as well. And you read it aloud and demonstrate sort of how you want them to use that intonation to carry that meaning. And then which words are important too. So if you see a word that sort of establishes a contrast, like the word however, that's a strong one that you're going to model through to the students and how to bring that across. Okay, another thing that you might like to do if you're in a monolingual environment is you can compare and contrast stress across languages. So this is me teaching German, actually, but I had this English sentences here on the board. And so we identified, okay, how would you say this in English? Or even I had two Brazilian students in the group, and I would say, okay, can you say that sentence for me in Portuguese? And they say, oh, what's that syllable? And I asked them, what was the syllable that they said more strongly? And then they said, yeah, that. Okay, so what's that in German here? Okay, now you need to emphasize that syllable. So the sentence was, Carol said she went to a festival. And then festival is here in the German sentence, and there are some other bits after that, but that's still the main stress syllable that we're going to use. So coming to English, okay, how would I say it in English? Carol said she went to a festival. Carol hat gesagt, dass sie auf ein Festival gegangen ist. So you can still hear that there's that strong stress there, yeah? Michael said he played basketball. Michael hat gesagt, dass Basketball gespielt hat. So we've still got that stress on that same syllable. And it makes students feel comfortable as well if you're going between languages, because they can own the meaning of the sentence more if they've done it in their first language. And then it's easier for them to bring that across to their language after that. Yeah, sorry, to English or the target language. Okay, and just another thought as well. Essentially, every single text can be read aloud. There's phonology in every text. Yeah, so every sign, everything. I mean, you're not going to go around the street like reading every single street sign, but kids do. Have you noticed that? Like even street signs, like kids might walk around and just read a sign aloud because they've unlocked or decoded the sound, the phonology behind everything. There is no text. Correct me if I'm wrong. There is no text on this planet that cannot be read aloud. Even this is, an academic text here. This is instructions for a Boss guitar pedal. Incorrect handling of batteries. Rechargeable batteries or a battery charger can cause leakage. I wouldn't get students to read that aloud, but I'm just pointing out that there is no text that you cannot read aloud, essentially. There is always phonology behind it. Photo 6 to 7, copyright Aaron Huey, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? Okay, again, I'm not saying use these kinds of text in class, but just reiterating the point that every text can be read aloud, even if it's a text that has been designed for reading and not to be read aloud, like a news article or something like that. And a news article will be more content heavy and unnatural to read aloud. It's still possible to read it aloud, which means that when students are reading silently, they should still be kind of somewhat activating the phonological loop, the subvocalization in their minds. Okay, some other thoughts. So to your students, stress the importance of pronunciation and reading aloud. I was talking about this to students today. They're like, oh, I've never thought about that. And then I started talking about graded readers and I brought in some graded readers to show the students and they all came crowded around and they're like, oh, that's great. I can understand everything. And then I played them some of the audio and they were really, really happy to be able to understand so much of it. And I said, yeah, that's it. You need to be able to pronounce all of this. You guys are A2, B1 students, and this is an A1 book. You should be able to pronounce all of this. So, reading aloud is a key skill to be able to do that. You can use transcription tasks in class. So if you're finding students are struggling with the pronunciation of particular words, you might choose little spot transcriptions that exemplify the pronunciation of those words. So with that example of real or real before with the Spanish speaking students, find a text with the word real in it. Did you notice how that speaker pronounced it? Or you could go to Youglish, and choose a couple of different things there and take them and get them to pronounce it. Oh, how did you pronounce that word? How would a Spanish speaker pronounce that word? How do you think an American speaker pronounces that word? How do you think an Australian speaker would pronounce that word? And then you can, get them to just be a little bit more aware of that. And then they can decide, oh, do I want to continue using my L1 influence pronunciation, or do I want to try and aim for one of these other pronunciations? Okay, so pronunciation. Oh, here. So yeah, definitely raise their awareness of pronunciation. So just in the way I was sort of saying, can you pronounce that in different ways? Here, pronunciation teaching reduces anxiety. Absolutely. I think most people will be in support of that if they're confident they know how to read it aloud. Once you do those activities, by the way, with the analysis of the stress and intonation, students will do that naturally. You give them a text the next day and they will just go, you'll see them moving their mouths and start to read the text aloud because they feel empowered that they know what to do now. Deprioritizing native speaker accent models does not mean not providing a model. The phonological loop requires sound to hold on to. Okay, if you're not sure, just teach using your accent. And you absolutely get competent speakers with all different accents and non-native speakers and native speakers. 100% go for that, but there must be some kind of sound to hold on to. You could get students to find their own model to imitate. Yeah, okay, we talked about that. And make sure you're integrating listening and reading tasks together. So you might find something that you can play to them and then they can read, or you take the audio from the book and then get them to read the transcript as well, and you can get them to read the transcript aloud at the end. So play around with that and definitely just teach your students that these are all linked in the classroom, that reading and listening, there's kind of a more gray line between them than we thought. Okay. That's pretty much it, actually. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, now for questions. Just going to flash up the references there, page 1, page 2, some book recommendations as well. And that's me.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'll let you catch your breath for a second because there are some questions coming your way. I mean, that was quite a whirlwind of information coming out there, lots of things I think for us to take away and think about, which is, I for one am very pleased this has been recorded because I know I'm going to have to go back and think about quite a few of those ideas there. Um, but some really nice ideas there about, it was making me think as well about how we can use transcripts more, even when we're doing a listening lesson. Those transcripts are also written. They're usually in the back of the book, so we can get students to pronounce bits of them or the whole thing, not necessarily copying what they've heard, but at least they know how to say things in a way that's comprehensible, I suppose. Questions. Okay, so one of the big questions is, you mentioned these two words throughout, but what would you say is the difference? We've been talking about, or sorry, you've been talking about teaching and developing pronunciation, but this word accent keeps coming up. What would you say is the difference between teaching accents and teaching pronunciation, and where does accent matter and where does it not matter?
Well, absolutely, intelligibility is the most important thing. That's something for you to definitely keep in mind. What exactly is intelligible varies from listener to speaker. If you've got two Spanish speakers speaking English together, they might be intelligible to each other, but not to other people with other L1s. So accent is sort of seen as intrinsically way that somebody speaks that is influenced by their L1, and pronunciation is some sort of malleable idea. As a musician, I fully believe that you can change the way that you speak if you like. It's a slippery subject in terms of identity, and some people hold accent close to identity, but the reality is also we need students to be understood. And, there was a Polish student that I had today, work and walk, they're different words. German speakers sometimes get were and where confused, and they pronounce them the same. That's going to lead to issues. And that's due to the L1 interference as well. So there's not strict definitions on them, unfortunately.
And I suppose in some ways it depends where these students are going to be using their English as well. If it's in a more international environment, then we're thinking of ELF, like you mentioned there. So it's kind of being as intelligible as possible to the maximum number of people. Whereas in some situations, if there are a lot of French speakers that are practicing their English together, they might have particular elements of an accent that they understand from each other in certain situations, I suppose.
Yeah. But I guess the point there is that is students thankful when you say, why do you pronounce it that way? They might not realize that they're not pronouncing it in a way that is not widely intelligible, or they might not realize that that's a French language informed pronunciation. It's like, okay, well, let's just have a listen to a few other pronunciations of that word. And just in doing so, you're sort of opening them to, or inviting them to think about if they would like to change their pronunciation or not. And that's their decision. I don't believe that we should be telling students to speak a certain way. We just show them a few different pronunciations, guide them to discover that for themselves, and then they can make their own minds up.
Absolutely. A couple of other questions coming here in terms of, you mentioned graded readers and you've mentioned different levels of students, sort of A1 through to C2. Does the approach change with the students depending on their level, or do you start from very low levels with these ideas and concepts that you've been talking through?
I'll absolutely use this at all levels. I find it's a bit trickier with learners in Germany. A lot of people have been learning English in schools, so their pronunciation, for lack of a better term, might be fossilized, or they've been saying things a certain way for a very, very long time. So it's harder for them cognitively to overcome that embedded pronunciation. But there's a limited number of sounds in English, so it doesn't take that long to go through them all. And if you identify, there'll only be 3 or 4 different sounds, I would imagine, from most languages that are particularly challenging. I would absolutely get each student of different nationalities, different language backgrounds to find out what those sounds are, and then make a decision about, do you want to continue to pronounce it in this way, or would you like to try and work on this? And if so, I would like to support you with that. And that's not level dependent at all.
Excellent. Good. A couple of other people here were, it was quite a complex question here, actually, which is good. So I'll read it out directly. Okay, so one of your slides mentioned that the phonological route and the direct memory route operate in parallel and reinforce each other. Do you think, again, this comes back to levels, does this look or differ depending on the level of students, or again, is that across the board?
So that model there, that was for, well, when we're expert readers, so let's say now L1, then we will be enjoying direct access to word meaning. So you probably don't need to sound out a text. If you read a text in your first language, you can fly down the page. And that's because your brain immediately recalls the meaning of those words due to the hard work you put in as a youngster learning to read sounding words aloud. So Deon says that these two have been basically solidified together over time and are recalled together because of that cognitive effort that you put in at the time. So if you're a learner of a language, you haven't got that background of strengthening the sound and the meaning in your brain and these two roots being activated together. You cannot enjoy direct access to meaning without sound if you don't really recognize the word. You are forced to sound it out. So learners will be relying more on the phonological route, and it's only when they become more and more proficient that they can enjoy direct access without the phonology. However, that's not the case for cognates, and that's an issue. So if students see the word international, internacional, internacional, they might recall their Spanish, their German pronunciation of it, but it doesn't impede comprehension. Their brain is directly accessing that word meaning, but it's reinforcing their L1 pronunciation.
And in terms of the reading as well, a couple of people have said, that they tend to do this quite quietly, maybe under their breath, almost whispering. When you were talking about the reading aloud activities here, is this something, what kind of volume can we expect our learners to be reading aloud at, do you think?
If you create a supportive classroom atmosphere that allows mistakes and rewards mistakes, and you model having fun with language, you model different ways of pronouncing things. When kids are learning a foreign language, they say, okay, say it like a mouse. Now say it like a bear. And they have fun with it. So when they then experiment themselves, there's no fear in the room. But that's the teacher's decision to work out how they would do it. You might do it in pairs. Definitely give the students lots and lots of preparation or other tasks with the text so they're familiar with the word meaning. You might say, look, we're going to read it aloud tomorrow, so you can go home and practice on your own. You can use a tool online to have the text read aloud to you if you like, or you might just start with a single sentence or something like that. So definitely find a partner, somebody that they can trust, and just set it up so the student is absolutely supported, and that fear, if there's fear, it's not going to work. So make sure you're not supporting that fear in some way and get rid of it.
So to come back on what I think you've just said there, and a couple of people asking that the ideas you're suggesting are sort of in addition, they're not replacing those traditional concept checking or comprehension questions, or maybe those questions that get students involved with the text that are more sort of personality based or personalization. You've read a text, what would you do in this situation, kind of thing. What you're suggesting is in addition to this.
Absolutely. I'm not discounting the usefulness. But to be able to read the text aloud, though, they do need to be able to comprehend the text. It's not going to be possible without that. So, but
as you said earlier, if we're asking them to do that too early on, then they might not, especially at lower levels, depending on the level of the text as well. There's so much cognitive load going on there where they're trying to focus on getting the words out correctly, that they're not actually listening to what they're saying, I suppose.
I would recommend just read a text to the students first. Don't that's so much more valuable than even just playing the audio. You do it to the students, show how much fun you're having with them. Or you could tell a little anecdote, write a little anecdote, read the anecdote to the students, make it be a personal anecdote about yourself, and show how much emotion and energy can be transmitted with that. And it becomes exciting for the students if you can do that first.
And I suppose when they're doing this kind of stuff in pairs or reading aloud to each other, like you were mentioning, then you do the feedback in the same sort of way that you would do if they were doing a speaking task or a role play. You're kind of picking out maybe general issues that people have, or highlighting really good practices. Is that the kind of monitoring and feedback you're doing?
Absolutely. And look, that's an interesting point too, because if you're talking about speaking tasks, the cognitive load is higher for speaking tasks than it is for reading aloud. Because for speaking tasks, they need to think about what they want to say. They need to think about the relationship to the person. They need to think about grammar, vocabulary. All of these elements are coming together. But reading aloud compartmentalizes the pronunciation skill and works on that in isolation. And hopefully there will be some transfer, obviously, back to when they're speaking freely after that. But you can reduce the cognitive load in doing so. So shyer students may be very happy to read aloud for that reason.
Excellent. Well, we're just about coming to our time. A few people here have asked if you've got it still handy. Could you reshare your bibliography and the pictures of those books? I think lots of people are ready to take, and they can contact you as well, of course. But yes,
absolutely.
There we go.
Feel free
people
to
are
send me
taking screenshots all over the place, I imagine.
Yeah.
of
I'll give
those
you
ones.
yeah, 3 seconds and then I'll move to the second one here.
As you are changing slides there, I just want to finish off by saying thank you very much again for the whirlwind of information there and ideas. You know, it's all solidly based in the reading research you've done, kind of inspiring as a teacher and teacher educator to go into that much depth in something that you're obviously very, very passionate about. It's infectious in the most positive way that word can be used. And I think lots of people are saying the very same thing here, and people will enjoy this video as well, which I will definitely be going back to watch this recording. So thank you very much for all of your time today. And thanks to everyone who joined us today for the live session. Again, you will be getting the recording of this sent out to you and a record of attendance as well, a kind of certificate. So Mike, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your evening. You said the weather was nicer there, so I hope you've got a nice walk or something to go on now to relax.
I do. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thanks very much, everyone. See you next time.